Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am Jen Cord, Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario, and I am very pleased to welcome you to our sponsored webinar with ACOM, Strengthening Municipal Road Programs, National Benchmarking Trends, and Advanced Prioritization and Scenario Evaluation Tools for Roads Asset Management Planning. Just rolls right off the tongue. We're joined here today by Chris Lombard, Donghui Liu, Luke Zhao from ACOM, as well as Mustafa Awadallah from the city of Ottawa. And I'm going to be handing it over to them in just a moment. First, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So while I recognize that we're meeting virtually, I'm joining from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples, their deep connection to this land, and we're committed to reconciliation. Do please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, and you can also recognize the land that you're joining from if you would like to do so. Onto a little bit of housekeeping. We will have time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. We'll use the chat box for that. So if you have questions as we go, please put them into that chat box, and we'll pose those at the end of the session. You can also, as I said, introduce yourselves in the chat box. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Chris for ACOM, who will take you through the presentation.
Thanks, Jen. You did a great job in reading that title. It's a very garbled title. I'm not going to read it again. So just moving to the next slide, introductions from our team here today on the call. My name is Chris Lombard. I'm the practice lead for asset management with ACOM based in Vancouver. Donghui.
My name is Donghui, asset management manager for Ontario. Thank you. Luke.
Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Zhao. I'm a senior asset management consultant and planning engineer at ACOM. I'm happy to be here and honored to share my work with you. Mustafa.
Okay, good day, everyone. My name is Mustafa Awadallah. I work for the City of Ottawa and the Asset Management Service Group.
Thanks, everybody. So the next slide, our agenda for today is to look at a couple of roads, asset management, emerging trends in Canada, asset management innovations and case studies. We're looking at project prioritization, funding allocation and scenario development, and lifecycle modeling. And then we'll close it out with a couple of thoughts on the way forward. Next slide, please. So we'll discuss a couple of emerging trends in asset management planning for roadways. So on the left-hand side, we show a pie chart looking at the estimated replacement value breakdown for Ontario municipalities. So i.e. where the asset value is residing in terms of the different asset classes of municipal agencies. So roadways make up 27%. So more than a quarter of asset value sitting within roadways. If you look at bridges as well, bridges and culverts on the left, another 8%. So maybe about 30% you could argue sitting within roads and culverts. So the challenge with roads are they're the largest asset class for most municipalities, as shown by that pie chart. They compete with limited funding within the municipal tax base. So they're competing against parks and rec facilities, housing, and other essential municipal services. They're, of course, critical to daily life. We can't do without roads. The roadway infrastructure is aging with limited reinvestment. So there's a growing backlog and obviously increasing risk that goes along with it. But there are also evolving expectations. For example, complete streets, climate resilience, the growth of EVs, equity, and multimodal mobility. So the next slide, we show a couple of, two major projects that we've been working on that we've been using for sort of input information to this study. On the left-hand side, we've got the CB, the Canadian Infrastructure Benchmarking Initiative. So ACOM has been managing that project for more than 25 years, where we benchmark water, sewer, drainage, roadways, and transportation, solid waste. Assets. Over the last 5 years, we've been strengthening our roadways or transportation benchmarking, and we've been receiving really good inputs from our clients, a lot of good support on that, a lot of good learning from the roadways benchmarking. Then on the right-hand side, we completed a project for City of Ottawa in the last year. It was called the Investment Prioritization Study. And part of that study was to conduct a survey, national survey across Canada, in terms of general information, current prioritization practices, and pavement rehab practices. And that's part of the content and information we'll be sharing with you today. For that study, we received 13 responses in total. So we've identified maybe 3 high-level trends in terms of roadway asset management planning. On the next slide, please. So the first slide is related to there's an increasing backlog, potentially an increasing backlog, demanding more mature prioritization. So on the left-hand side, we've got another graph from the FAO by pie chart showing the backlog. Backlog is considered the infrastructure that are in need of renewal and rehabilitation. So roadways constitute 41% of the backlog. So no surprises there. We know the roadways are on poor condition, maybe worsening as well. And then if you overlay bridges on top of that, maybe 45% of the backlog within Ontario for infrastructure is residing within roadways and bridges. But it's not all doom and gloom. You know, if we look at the benchmarking graphic that I show on the right-hand side, that line graph shows 3 lines representing the percentage of road network in poor to very poor condition. And we took the Canadian benchmarking median for that. The gray line shows the Canadian median, the green line shows municipalities outside of Ontario, and then the red line shows municipalities within Ontario. Basically, the backlog has sort of Canadian median was about, or road, put it this way, the roads in poor to very poor condition, sitting at 12% in 2019 and trended down to about 14, 15, 16% in 2023. But you can see a significant improvement from 23 to 24, especially in Ontario, going down to from about 15, 16% to about 6, 7, 8% in 2024. You know, it's sort of trending in the right direction. Maybe you could argue maybe it's because of Ontario Regulation 588/17. Maybe there was just a backlog in investment taking place since COVID, and then sort of it's a catch up in 2024. But we'll certainly keep an eye on this metric for not only for roadways but for the other asset classes as well, especially in Ontario, to see if we can see an improvement in you know, the condition of the assets going forward. On the next slide, we, as part of the Ottawa survey, we also asked a question in terms of the top roadway asset management challenges that the 13 participants or respondents are dealing with. And they said 12 of the 13 said limited budget, a key challenge. 9 of the 13 said increasing cost of materials and labor is a key challenge. And then also 9 of the 13 said balancing short-term and long-term needs. So it's clear that financial challenges, roadway asset management challenges, are primarily related to lack of investment or limited funding available for investment in roadways. On the next slide, our second trend would be related to, sorry, before I get to that slide, just a final slide in terms of prioritization. We asked a question in terms of organizations and municipalities' level of maturity. This comes out of the Ottawa survey. We divided the maturity up into 4 levels, all the way from developing to define to manage and optimize. And of the 13 respondents, 7 said they have a defined methodology. So looking at structured processes with clear criteria, primarily qualitative but applied consistently. And then 3 out of the 13 said they have a managed, a little bit more sophisticated methodology. And then 2 optimized and 1 developing. I think the key takeaway from this is that the majority of respondents show that they have a defined, fairly okayish prioritization methodology, but not super sophisticated. In terms of the massive backlog that they exist and the challenges with finding a way to fund the right assets, there's certainly opportunity to improve the approach to prioritization of roadways and transportation assets. So on the next slide, we have the second trend that we identified, saying that local roads are not adequately funding, and sort of even worse than RTLs and collectors. So from the benchmarking data that we show there, we show a trending in terms of the percentage of roadway network renewed. In terms of the green line, at the dark green line at the bottom shows local roads, and the lighter green line would be arterials and collectors. Prior to 2023, we collected data put arterials and collectors together. In 2023, we split it out in terms of arterials, collectors, and locals. You can see, focusing on the locals at the bottom, they've been trending down from 1.5% being renewed in 2019 to only about 0.9% renewed in 2023. So not a really good trend. And if you look at, think of 0.9% of the local roads renewed in 2023, it will take 111 years to get around to renewing that road again. So it's clearly not sustainable. If you look at collector roads, 71% or 71 years, and arterial roads, 28 years. So you just off the top of your head, those renewal rates are not sustainable. So the funding for especially local roads are not sustainable. Next slide, please. The next trend that we identified was just growth in electrical vehicle infrastructure or aspects related to EVs. The bar chart at the left shows the growth, again, Canadian benchmarking data showing the number of electric charging stations. The green bars show that there's been a significant increase since 2018 in terms of electrical charging stations per 1,000 population. And then in the same vein, the electricity consumed in terms of the blue line also showed a big increase since 2020 up to 2024. So clearly, there's a bigger demand for EVs. So in 2026, Canada revised the EV policy. It sort of restarted the National EV Purchase Incentive Program after a temporary pause in 2025. So there's also the transition to 100% zero emission vehicles objective by 2035. Whether they'll be able to reach that target, not so sure, but definitely there's a trend towards more EV vehicles on the road. And then also charging station infrastructure is expanding. So what does it mean for roadways? So EVs are heavier and wear out roads faster. Municipalities will have to think about strengthening the structural design of their roadways to be able to carry the heavier loads of the EVs. And then there will be more frequent road asset interventions needed on the roads that have not been upgraded. So that's definitely something we'll see into the future. From a financial point of view, the impact would be there would be fewer gas vehicles, meaning lower fuel taxes. So cities will need to find new ways to fund their road networks, as if they don't have enough problems as of yet. So just in summary, next slide, key takeaways. There's a growing backlog, potentially a growing backlog, limited budget, and the need for more mature prioritization. Local roads are not getting enough attention, even more so than arterials and collectors. Climate change and electrification are reshaping road needs. And then municipalities will have to explore alternative funding strategies and funding sources to strengthen their long-term sustainability. Right, so now that I've set the stage for our discussion, I will now hand over to Luke and the others to take us through some asset management innovations and project case studies. Luke.
Thank you so much, Chris. To begin with, at AECOM, we apply a 4-pillar approach to asset management, so including the organization, process, data, technology. And these pillars ensure that asset management is strategically aligned and operationally effective. So within the process pillar, I like to emphasize 3 specific areas showing on this slide. So first, the project prioritization. This is deciding which projects to implement first to align with the project criticality and the strategic goals. And the second, funding allocation. This is to determine how scarce resources are distributed. We also have life cycle modeling, very important element. This is to help us predict the asset deterioration and identify the optimal timing for the maintenance, rehabilitation, and replacement to maximize our asset in the long run. So as you may find that, so these 3 areas are highly interdependent, and so they are some of the most technically challenging components of the asset management. And we will elaborate on them using our innovative approach and the case studies in the following sections. So I'll hand it over to Mustafa for the first area.
Thank you, Luke. We'll talk about project prioritization and some of the challenges that we may face with this kind of like a typical prioritization exercise. So one of the major issues that we face is the project readiness, which is essentially what it means is just to make sure that the project is going to go into the construction is actually ready for construction. There's no other prerequisite that's still needed. for the project to be implemented. So in the urban context, for example, it could be there is a sewer that needs to be repaired, there's a water main that needs to be fixed before the road resurfacing. We want to all address all these needs ahead of the road resurfacing. So that's just a very important thing to keep in mind. In the rural context, it could be like a culvert that needs to be replaced, a drainage or ditch project that needs to be done first, or combined with the road resurfacing. So like just making sure that all the prerequisites are met prior to the road resurfacing. That's a really important challenge that needs to be like looped in or like factored in into overall project prioritization process. Other factors is just the impact of other major projects, which essentially what it means is the cities or it could be like in a municipality or jurisdictions, like there's so many other projects happening at the same time, and you should be mindful or like factoring in other projects around your kind of like planned like list of projects. Sometimes there is a lack of visibility between other projects, so this is something that might pose a challenge to you. So sometimes you might be surprised that there's a project nearby that's planned in years, but you didn't know about it. So visibility is very crucial in terms of planning. Sometimes even there is a project that's kind of like there's a mutual need between your resurfacing or overlaying needs, but at the same time, the same project is planned for a major, bigger project, what we call like integrated. Sometimes it's called like a complete street or like a, which essentially what it means, like, the infrastructure will be renewed at once, which like these are like major projects. It takes time for this project to plan because they drive substantial amount of money, and sometimes they really impact your prioritization process, because you either have to wait for them to be done, or sometimes you have to, sometimes what we do actually, we're still going to go ahead and pave the road, what we call like a temporary or interim intervention until that future project comes in. So that's factors like these should be kind of like kept in mind. And even sometimes like a nearby major project will actually dictate the timeline of your planned project. So you have a project that you want to plan in 2027, but like there's a nearby major project that's still happening, and there's traffic restrictions, traffic detour requirements that will prevent you from proceeding with your project in 2027. You probably would have to wait in 2028 until this other project is completed. So all these challenges will kind of like a real world example challenge that will have to be factored into your prioritization. Other thing is also sometimes a project will be triggered. Actually, if we go back, look to the other slide, if you don't mind. So we're still talking about like if there's any other different triggers. Sometimes a road will have multiple utility cuts due to a previous water main project or a previous sewer project, and this is, for example, that case was not, or that project was not part of your overall list, but now there's a need for you to include it. So, like stuff like this, you have to be mindful of. Mismatching priority, this is the third kind of like challenge. Sometimes this happens, but it's a very minor, very slow, low impact, but it sometimes would happen between you and your adjacent jurisdictions or neighborhood. So sometimes they would have a different methodology or a different framework that you use. You want to do a road in a specific year, they would have a different need or a different year. So there might be a mismatch in priority between you and your adjacent jurisdictions. Next two, please. So for all these reasons, there's always like a complex trade-off, like between even, the different factors. Sometimes you want to include, like there's so many factors that contribute to the overall project prioritization, and you have to have like a very fine balance between all these contributing factors, and you have to be carefully evaluating this. We're going to talk about this much more in the next few slides. The one also other criteria, so other challenges is the lack of clear criteria. It's something, if your program is mainly driven by an ad hoc basis or selective choices or subjective choices, you're going to have a lot of troubles explaining this to the member of the public or the general or the elected officials. So it's always good to have a clear criteria, create standard criteria that's applicable citywide in a very fair and equitable basis. So that's, like what we talk about we're going to talk about this later when we talk about risk. Influence of politics, that's something also you have to be mindful of. Sometimes you would be questioned if there's a specific road is selected for treatment or if a road is not selected for treatment. You could be questioned either way. You have to be ready for a kind of like providing a kind of like a rationale or an explanation for these kind of decisions. Next, Luke. So on this slide here, what you can see here is just, this is the existing, let's call it like the project selection process that we follow. And this is kind of like, let's call it traditional, or we have been using this up until very recent. But we're going to talk about in this slide or next slide that we did kind of like a case study, and we improved or changed that kind of like the overall selection framework. So as you can see here, like there's like few blocks in the top, which are the yellow blocks. These are kind of like, let's call them criterion 1. So this is kind of like an output from our payment management application. Essentially, you can run an analysis or a budget analysis. It's an application where or a software where it has all the network inventories, and then it has all the, you know, like there's also like a pavement deterioration curves, decision trees, unit rates. Like all these are embedded in the software in the background. And then essentially what you need to do is we run kind of like a budget analysis for a specific period. It could be 10 years, it could be 5 years, depending on your funding envelopes. And then it will spit you out like few candidates or like a pool of candidates that you can select from. And so this is, you know, like this will be kind of like your first criterion. It's usually based on the cost effectiveness, unless you want to change the setting and go with worst first. So this is a different option. It's valid for a specific type of assets, but for the vast majority of the assets, cost effectiveness will be the way to go. So, and then the second criterion, which is essentially the ranking of the pool of candidates that were output of the first criterion. So essentially, you have a big list of roads. You don't know, kind of like, are you starting from, you know, like the first one or the last one? So there is a methodology that we used to follow, which is essentially kind of like the ranking of all these what we call like a super sections, or all these kind of like road segments. These two will give you like the project list. The risk, as you can see here, it was not really actually contributing to the overall project selection process. It was used as more of a tiebreaker or a secondary or supplementary check, but it was not part of the, it was not officially part of the process. Next. So some of the risk framework improvements that we did, so we, as part of the case study, we reviewed our existing risk framework, and we did some sort of like improvements to it by including some additional factors. For example, we did include, for example, equity as a factor. It was not there before. We also included flood perspective, or kind of like a flood-prone roads, which essentially kind of like mimicking any future climate change we should be aware of. So all these two criteria were added to the overall risk framework. With a specific weight for sure. And then the next improvement we did was just the refining of the weights, which is essentially is actually an ongoing process, not necessarily a one job you will do and then you will be done with it. It's a continuous process. It's something that you will do, and then you will wait and see, and maybe wait for a year and see how does it really work out for you. And then if you might need to go back and refine the weights a little bit. Adjusting scoring scale, our existing risk framework is a 5-point scale for the likelihood of failure and 5-point scale for the consequences of failure. So the multiplication of these two will give you a 25 points for the risk. But one of the things that we discussed in the study, perhaps it might be a better communicated message if you were to change the scale from from 25 to 100, essentially by just multiplying it by 4. It might give you, like for me, it will help me out a lot more in knowing, for example, a road, 73 out of 100 is easier to understand rather than a road that says, 3.287. Like the decimals, you might be a little lost on the decimals, but it's just easier to go for a scale from 0 to 100. It will give you like a much more valuable input. One thing also we did, which is the improving of the visualization. As you can see here, like we created this fish bone diagram, and we did not have this before. So one of the output of this case study is actually to visually put everything on all at once in one graph. It's just easier to grasp at one glance. You would see what are the contributing factors, what are the weights, what's kind of like the scale for each one, and you can also see like like which one's classified as likelihood of failure, which one's classified as consequence of failure, because municipalities or jurisdictions might have a different view of how they define risk. Other ideas that we discussed as well is just the continuous versus discrete functions. Some of the factors actually in the risk framework are using a discrete function. One example is actually the traffic volume. So you can see a traffic volume goes from 4,000 to 7,000. They will still receive essentially the same risk score, which is 3. To me, it does not make a lot of sense because you might have a road, like everything else is equal. I would think, of a road that's received 4,000 vehicles per day should be treated differently from a road that receives 7,000 vehicles per day. So for that reason, we actually did add kind of like a continuous function to represent these kind of factors, which essentially what it did is it's actually added much more granularity to the data. So you have now much more fine data to work with. For the ranking process, essentially it's going to help you out. Last thing here I have is the sensitivity analysis tool. So there was, like a sensitivity analysis tool just dedicated for that risk framework. Essentially what it does, you can go ahead, change the risk score factor, just see how does it impact the overall risk. So change the factor and see how it impacts the risk. As you can see here, like you can visually represent this in a heat map. For example, it will tell you like how many kilometers in road that resides in the top right-hand quadrant. So this one would be considered like extremely high risk, and then the lower left-hand quadrant will be the kind of like the minimal or low risk. So by changing these factors, it will tell you the story, okay, like how many kilometers are traveling from this category to another, so you can actually understand the impact of each one. You can visually even see this by the bar chart here, like which is going to represent you kind of like the pre and post, with any adjustment that you make. Next, please. One other thing that also did as part of the case study is actually to review any common factors or any kind of like mutual factors, and then like just to streamline the process, anything that's similar, we have to kind of like eliminate it or just reduce the impact of it. And the next one, thank you. So last slide I have here is just okay, like what out of all this, like this is now the proposed framework. It's based on two main criteria, and the first one is just kind of like, as we talked about, just is going to be the product of the payment managed application, and then the second criteria would actually now be inclusion of the risk, as I said, not as a secondary check, but more of like a primary factor now. And essentially what's going to be the output of the roadmap application will be will tell you, okay, like here is your kind of like your defined list, and then anything that's kind of like of a high risk that's not suggested by the payment management application will also be considered in the process. With that, I will hand it over back to you, Luke.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mustafa. So the next area we would like to chat about is the funding allocation and the scenario evaluation. So let's start with some reality we're facing today. So across the municipality, we found that the budgets are flat and in some cases shrinking. While infrastructure continue to age and deteriorate, that creates a growing gap between what assets actually needs and what funding is available. So over time, this gap translates into rising backlogs, higher risk, and more difficult trade-offs. And at the same time, the funding is really simple, and typically it comes from the multiple sources. We have taxes, grants, development charges, and user fees, and each source often comes with its own restrictions. So these funding silos limit the flexibility. Even if a municipality see a clear priority, it may not have freedom to shift dollars to where they are most urgently needed. The third challenge is perhaps the most difficult: how to allocate the limited funds in a way that both effective and defensible. It's not just about improving the road network condition. The munis must balance the performance, fairness across the regions or asset classes, considering risks, as Mustafa mentioned, and the longer-term sustainability. So all those things will also align with the policy direction and the council priorities. So this is exactly where our structured scenario analysis becomes essential. It can help the leaders clearly understand the trade-offs before committing scarce resources. So building on the funding challenges we just discussed, so the next step is understand what practical path we can take to evaluate the funding allocation. So at the early planning stages, it's critical to test a range of funding scenarios. We can see that the first one, we can we can have the modest budget increases or decreases to understand how different funding levels influence the outcome. And municipality can also consider define some performance targets at this stage, such as improving overall road condition or simply just maintaining the current level of service. So once the actual budget envelope is confirmed in most cases, and more tailored strategies can be applied. So that includes some idea like invest big early, meaning investing heavily upfront to reduce the backlog, and or the focus more on some certain areas, meaning some shifting of funding between the asset classes or reallocating investment geographically. So for Ottawa study, we developed and analyzed a total of 14 scenarios, and allowing us to clearly compare the trade-offs and identify the balanced path forward. So let me briefly explain how we evaluate the funding scenarios. We started with a broad set of metrics covering cost, risk, and performance. And those metrics came from different applications, platforms, models, tools. And through discussion and refinement with the city staff, we narrowed this down to 4 key measures and ultimately define the overall effectiveness. So these 4 key measures, including the risk score, the PQI, payment quality index, the backlog and deficiency levels. And each of these metrics were assigned a weighting using a structured pairwise comparison process. And this allowed the staff to explicitly express what matters most. This balanced approach also ensured that no single factor dominates the decisions. And so, for example, the risk score tells us whether we're reducing the likelihood of the road failures. The PQI changes allows whether overall network condition is improving or declining over time. The backlog reflects the cost implication of deferred maintenance, and the deficiency captures how many roads fall below the minimum acceptable standards. So by bringing these measures together into a weighted framework, the city can compare the strategy through a multi-criteria lenses. So this chart shows the final ranking results for the 14 funding scenarios. Excuse me. So at the top, we can see that unlimited budget target PQI of 65 and maintain current PQI of 55. These scenarios deliver the strongest overall performance with the greatest improvements in PQI and lowest backlog levels. However, it's important to know that these options require substantially higher funding levels than the available budget right now. The remaining scenarios operate within the existing funding envelope, but apply different allocation strategies. So we tested a modest budget increase of 1 to 2%, and their overall scores, as you can see here, are not very significantly different from the baseline. We also want to mention that the allocating around 10% to the local roads ranks relatively higher compared to a scenario that allocating more funding to the local roads. And this highlights the trade-off. As you can see, moderate adjustment to the local roads can be beneficial, but the over concentration in this area may reduce the overall effectiveness. So to support the comparison of different funding allocation scenarios, we developed a scenario ranking tool in Excel, which you can see on the screen. So this tool, as I mentioned, pulls directly from the analysis outputs and automate the calculation. So the users can quickly see how different scenarios perform under certain weighting assumptions. It has also the flexibility to set up the weighting configuration, to control the analysis period, and some other parameters. And lastly, it is very easy to customize the visualization and generate output printouts. And so overall, we feel this tool could improve the efficiency while also providing a transparent and flexible and fast framework to support the decision making. And lastly, let me briefly walk through the key findings from our funding allocation scenario analysis. So overall, what we found is that using this multi-criteria approach makes a significant difference. So it allows the agencies to clearly see the trade-offs and leading to more transparent and data-informed decisions. And for the analysis, as I mentioned, so when we tested some small increases over the current budget, say like 1 to 2%, the improvements were relatively modest. It might be true for many other municipalities who have a higher backlog. We also saw limited gains in the overall condition and the backlog reduction from this scenario setup. Similarly, when the funding was split by, for example, the environment, we'll call it environment means like we allocate certain percentage to the urban versus local, and the overall impact was also minimal. On the other hand, if we invest early and more significantly, so we call it front loading, and for example, allocating like 10-15% of the future 5 to 10 years as the first year, it could deliver the strong results, particularly in risk reduction. But this makes intuitive sense because early intervention prevents deterioration and could result in lower lifecycle cost. However, in practice, we also know that this approach is often constrained by the physical realities and competing priorities. We also look at the targeting higher road condition standards. So while this improves overall network condition, it requires substantial more funding to sustain. And finally, increasing the allocation to the local roads did improve overall network PQI or condition. However, this came with the trade-offs. We observe that arterial and collectors backlogs and high-risk sections became unaddressed, and this suggesting that dedicating more than a certain share of budget to the local roads may not be practical. So I would say the key takeaway for this section is that municipalities must strike a careful balance between the available funding and the desired level of service. So the service targets needs to be financially sustainable while also aligned with the policy priorities and the council direction. So now our approach here is able to provide a structured and transparent way to support a more tailored funding allocation strategies. With that, I'll hand it over to Donghui for the next section.
Thank you, Luke. So building on the prioritization and funding allocations we just discussed, so the investment decision ultimately depend on how reliable the data is, the life cycle model assumptions, and the logic we used in the model. Most municipalities in Ontario today already have the life cycle model developed through the asset management planning or payment management system implementations or decision supporting system implementations, and that might be 10 years ago. So the question is the model we developed years ago still representing how our road behave today? There are some common challenges we keep on seeing. These are not single municipality issue, they are the patterns. So the first one is data gap. Municipalities have inventories and periodic condition rating, but the gaps is around there, including the segmentation, the missing treatment history, or the condition data that is not comparable year over year because we use different vendors. The vendor use different methodology, and we even use some different condition categorization threshold. So when those pieces are inconsistent year over year, the models can run, but it will be difficult to defend on our results. The second one is around the decision supporting software. It may not be about the software itself, but it is about the sustainment. So over time, the treatment libraries, the decision trees, the deterioration curve become set and forget. we've seen only a few people, sometimes only one people in an organization know how to tune the logic, how to use the system. And training is limited. Updates maintained occur during the AMP cycles. So those system and tool continue producing the results, but the confidence in the results decline because the logic setup is no longer transparent to today's user. The third one is around limited integration with other system, which actually breaks the learning loop. So we've seen that PMIS system do not typically have a standard API to link to different corporate system like GIS or maintenance management system or financial system. And also what is executed in the field doesn't reliably sort of provide feedback into the model. So the treatment history become updated, the cost is not reliable, and the models started to reflect how the program is actually delivered. So we need to modernize the data, the process, and our model logic. On the next slide, if you look at the key mechanisms of a life cycle model, look, we can click more. So we combine the asset inventory analysis period, the inflation, the discount rate, the intervention types, costs and triggers, and deterioration model, scenario setup, everything. So these elements form the foundation of the analysis. If they drift over time, the output will drift as well, and they no longer reflect the payment behavior. The second part is on the prioritization logic in these systems. Most of us has already covered a lot of the examples that we need to consider. So often this is where strategy becomes action. So the model may use the condition, the risk, or some ranking indicators or coordination with utilities to determine which project we move forward under different scenarios. But if we don't update these prioritization framework periodically as our practice evolve, the model will continue to apply yesterday's rule to today's rules. So on the next slide, once we have the model results, like that's translated into the summary or dashboard, like the ones that's shown here, you're probably familiar. We've gone through the OREG. So these visuals bring together state of infrastructure, funding condition, fundings projections, and condition projections. And ultimately, we're looking for a work program or a capital project list that we can use to inform the capital budgeting. And this is typically what leadership rely on when discussing the funding scenarios and trade-off. So if we want stronger road asset management planning and stronger support at the political decision-making level, these dashboard must be clear and be trusted and explainable. We have all the backup that we need to have. So if the suggested treatment is not aligned with what the reality or the engineer's judgment, the confidence will decline. And another key point is if you look into the deterioration curve or the condition projection curve just below the slide, we all report on the proposed level of service. And for road, it is often the condition relevant performance measures as per the OREG AMP requirement. So the condition forecast is really depending on the deterioration curve in the model. Even some small curve changes can significantly shift the long-term outlook, including your reported proposed service level over the next 10 years, the funding need, and the backlog. So the dashboard can maybe look nice, but what matters most is whether the logic underneath is current and also aligned with today's practice, so we can tell a strong story to justify our case. So how do we do to solve this? If we move on to the next slide. So one of the key questions is, does the PMIs or payment management system recommended work program actually match what engineers deliver in the field? Most of us has already talked about many considerations for prioritization that may make it not matching each other. But from the model perspective in the case study in Ottawa, we also investigate this topic by comparing the payment management system recommended rehabilitation strategy with the project that's actually executed in the field. And we sort of explore what is the match rate between the two and what's the reason for the differences. We've observed that the arterial road generally shows stronger alignment than the collectors, but we know there are some deviations beyond the model, like emergency repairs and stuff like that. Like I'd say Ottawa's case is pretty, like Ottawa is ahead of the curve, relatively strong alignment, but in contrast, we see some other municipalities that's pretty weak, like the model result only loosely used or not used at all to get the road program. So the core challenge is that we may have PMS system that we implemented years ago, and they were advanced at that time. But over time, the deterioration curve remained unchanged. The treatment type and triggering cost no longer reflect what we are today. So the results becomes disconnected. That's when the system started to feel like a black box. So the key takeaway is that our payment management system need a recalibration or modernization. So the pathways to moving towards a glass box. So to do this, sometimes it means we need a new software. And sometimes we should start by updating the decision logic or aligning with the current practice, including refreshing the assumptions, updating the deterioration curve, and updating the logic. So with this, I'm going to hand it over to Chris for the overall lessons learned.
Thanks, Donghui, and thanks, Luke and Mustafa, for your inputs. Hopefully, we've given you some food for thought in terms of roadway asset management planning. Just a couple of thoughts on the way forward. Primarily thinking about the massive backlog and the funding challenges for roadways in Ontario and elsewhere. It's essential to have support of senior leadership and politicians on the way forward. And hand in hand goes with the fact that we need to deepen our insights into transportation asset management context and challenges and be able to communicate that in a transparent, repeatable, consistent, and intuitive manner to our politicians and decision makers, because these are really complex issues that we need to be able to unpack to them in a way that they can consume it and make the best decisions for our roadways. And then ultimately, the complexity of the challenge is demanding smarter and broader transportation asset management planning, just as Donghui highlighted on her last slide. Right, so that brings us to the end of our presentations. Thanks for sitting in. We're happy to take any questions, please.
All right, thank you all very much. Yeah, I think lots to think about there. We are going to take questions now from the chat. So if you have questions, please do type those into the chat box. To just get ahead of what I know is always one of the most popular questions. Yes, we will be sharing the slides with you. The slides and the recording are going to be available both on the event page where you registered for this webinar and sent to you by email after the session. So just to get ahead of that one, and yeah, seeing a lot of applause. So yes, thank you very much to the ACOM team and to Mustafa. So I'll kick things off. Oh, perfect. Here we go. So we have a question in the chat from Isaac. How are you balancing the need for network level data to describe current states and projections to elected officials and decision makers versus the need for detailed project level information for construction delivery? Network level data is often much too average to make reasonable project prioritization decisions and misses the mark from my experience.
Mustafa, can I point that one in your direction, please?
Yeah, no, for sure. That's actually very great. Like, it's a great question because you can think of the data as two things, as mentioned. The question is either network level or either project level. In a network level planning, we do collect the data every few years, and it's really depending on what kind of data matters to your organization. Like, there's always a core data, there's always supplemental data. So, like, we do collect like traffic volumes, we do collect, like the condition, and all these would inform, as mentioned in the question, will inform the decision for the project prioritization. Project level data, which is essentially will inform, like the the decision when it comes to the actual design or actual implementation of the project. These ones would matter when we actually implement the project design itself or the project implementation itself. And there's always differences between what each data would the purpose of each data, but it's essentially both of them have different uses, different purposes, but the network level data should be used always for the planning purposes. The project level data should be used always for the project construction itself.
Excellent. Thanks, Mustafa. Okay, another question in the chat, and this is from Amber. When setting levels of service, it looks like you're focusing on average PQI. Have you considered setting levels of service as minimums for something like local versus arterial? Averages can hide problems where if you have a high proportion of very good and very poor roads, your average can show fair, showing you're meeting levels of service overall, but it's missing deficient roads.
Yeah,
Who'd
I
like
think
to
I
tackle
can.
that one?
Yeah, I
Luke,
think I
thank
can
you.
help with this one. This is a really good one, actually. So when we work with City of Ottawa, setting up the funding scenarios, and those are the preliminary scenarios we are evaluating. We did not set up the specific level of service for locals or arterials. However, we could do that, and we are actually another angle is to look at the locals and arterials, like so the payment management applications, Musa mentioned that has specific settings for figuring the rehabilitation and maintenance for the local road and arterial. And so at a certain condition, so definitely the rehabilitation, the treatment selection is different among local road, arterial, and the collectors. And another point is, so after we set up those finish analyzing those scenarios, and from the results, we can actually take out the average PQI for local roads, arterials, and collector. We made the comparison from that way. And from that way, we extract some meaningful responses, meaningful conclusions as I presented here. But yes, so if the city or council set up some specific level service, it will definitely could be incorporated into a more tailored scenario setting, as you suggested.
Excellent. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.
Okay. And yes, you got a thank you in the chat as well. I've got one more question for you. While we just wait and see if we've got other questions in the chat. Oh, and we did have one pop up while we were talking. Great. If I have a huge, I'll go to the chat. So if I have a huge proportion of the network in backlog, like over 35% or more, should I focus on reducing the backlog first, regarding the priority and road class to a manageable amount, then utilize the optimization results from the PMS results? Since the backlog roads are dragging down the average condition and they also have greater deterioration rate compared to good or fair roads.
I can take this one, Jane. It's actually a great question, because just like any other municipality, there's always like growing backlog. One thing in practice that we have been doing just to kind of like help this, like if you're doing a major road and then there is a nearby local roads that are in like poor to very poor condition, it would make sense from economy of scale, from benefiting from this large nearby project, to tackle these ones along the same time. So that could be one approach. Other approach that we have been thinking about also is just to do like a complete neighborhood at once. It's again like we would benefit from the economy of scale, and instead of like targeting like few local roads in one neighborhood, like it might be better for you to do like the whole neighborhood at once. You might have like a better unit rates in terms of like cost effectiveness. Just to focus on like exclusively on the locals or necessarily the poor and very poor. This is where it comes the beauty of running scenarios, and you can actually, with your pavement management application or pavement management system, you can actually run some scenario. You would say, okay, like for the next 2-3 years, I'm not going to do any critical assets, and I will just focus mainly on these backlogs. And then you're going to see like how this will impact your overall, let's call like the overall network average PQI, like how does it really compare at the end of your analysis? Like it might give you a different answer than what I'm giving you, but it's always worth to run your numbers in your own network, because each network is different. They have a different need, different conditions, and you not necessarily get the same answer if you run it in a different municipality. So I would always love to kind of like run these kind of like simulation and see where the kind of like the right answer would be, but it's always going to be dependent on your network and your data.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Mustafa. And yeah, the response to neighborhood strategy is a very good strategy. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up here. Another big thank you to Mustafa and to the ACOM team. Again, great presentation. I think really great to see those case studies and scenarios. So thank you very much. Thank you as well to everyone who attended today. Really great to see such a good crowd in the audience. We are going to ask you for some feedback. So we'll put the link to a survey in the chat right now. You will also get this survey in a follow-up email, which will contain the slides and the recording and a link to that webpage where we'll be hosting that. But yeah, it would be really great to hear from you. Helps to inform our future offerings. So please do take a moment. It's a very short survey, I promise you. So lovely to see everyone. Thanks again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.